Today we're doing part 2, the high and top tiers, for the official Jello Impact pre-Natlan power rankings tier list. A reminder that the reason that I do tier lists is because I think they're fun. Just because a character is low or high does not mean that you should or shouldn't use a certain character. And although I do have my certain favorite characters and teams that I prefer to play, I have gone through a painstaking effort of testing every possible team so that I could be as unbiased as I possibly can. These are the assumptions that we're going to be making. Let's get started. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. And if you appreciate the journey this channel is on and you want to support it or be part of the ride yourself, please consider subscribing down below. I almost never ask for subscribers, but I'm gonna ask it here because this video is the culmination of hundreds and hundreds of hours and honestly thousands of dollars spent getting every 5-star at C0, building up every single one of them to give them a fair shot and a fair shake to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. So thanks for subscribing. Let's get started. Before I reveal where we left off, I'm going to link part 1 in the description if you want to go click that and see part 1 without spoiling the whole list. I'm also going to have the full tier list with all the annotations available to see on Tactor. They are a channel partner here at Jello Impact, and we're actually going to do a giveaway. So you want to go click the link to see the full, nice, beautiful screenshot of the tier list after you watch the video, of course. And if you leave a little comment on there, you are going to be entered into a random giveaway where we're giving away 3 Welkin Moons. And all you need to do is be subscribed to the channel and go comment on the Tactor tier list. At the very bottom of tier 1.5 is going to be Sige. I'm doing tier 1.5 because I feel like the difference between 1.5 and 1 and even 2 is not that great. Sige. A lot of people will think that I'm kind of overrating putting Sige here. I think that's mainly because people haven't really played with her. What makes Sige good is her extreme healing. Completely off field, barely spend any time on field, and you just get infinite, unstoppable healing for your characters. Full party team heals just from using her skill. Depending on who you talk to, she can be an upgrade for mono hydro teams that you'd normally use Kokomi on. I've personally found that it clears slightly faster, but it very much depends on all your investment levels. I've also found some quick bloom teams with her are pretty good. All the teams that are good with her are with Farina because that's where her healing is actually valuable, and at least she gives a tiny buff to Farina to do more damage. I've also found that you can actually make Nilou work better than you might think by interspersing her burst at the right time in rotations. Still not insane, but definitely something solid, something on the same level as Candace or Barbara. So while definitely not as good as Kokomi, you'll see we'll put Kokomi quite a bit higher. Sigewin's not a bad character, and especially her comfort keeps her relatively high. What obviously holds her back is her reliance on Farina. She doesn't apply enough Hydro to really be on many teams outside of Farina teams, and a lot of Farina teams will use a second Hydro anyways, whether it's Yelan or Novelette. So generally speaking, her Hydro element doesn't do all that much for her, which is what holds her back from being better, but bottom of tier 1.5 for Sige. Charlotte, very similar to Sigewin. Basically infinite heals, extremely comfortable. The advantage that Charlotte has over Sigewin is that her element is just better, and Cryo, not being that great of an element, still has some use. She also has some use for melt Arlecchino stuff, but mostly it's Farina. And yeah, while Freeze is not generally that good of an element, applying lots of Cryo can be really nice to get some freezes since you're pairing her with Farina anyways, and this allows Novelette to have a freeze team. It allows Farina to have a freeze team with some other carry, and can generally just be a nice quality of life on top of the extreme healing that she provides. Also, on many teams that you would use Mika, like a Wanderer team or a Eula team, if freeze is ever useful and good, you don't lose that much. With Eula, you lose a bunch going from Mika to Charlotte, but you don't lose that much going to Charlotte because Charlotte can provide Thrilling Tales buff if you have C4+, and that's the same with Arlecchino. What holds her back is her insane ER requirements, makes her very hard to build, and generally just Cryo isn't that insane of an element, so she's at the bottom of tier 1.5. Next is Thoma. I actually had Thoma just below Charlotte for my top 11 4-stars, and Thoma lost on the list, but after thinking about it more, I think Thoma does deserve to be on a higher spot than Charlotte. He not only has Burgeon teams, but he also has Wanderer teams, and he also has Chevreuse Cloran teams, and these are all quite good quite good teams and quite good options. I think what holds him back is just his kit doesn't do that much crazy stuff. Like, he does provide a shield with interruption resistance, which is great, and he does proc Burgeons, but until we get, you know, another character that really makes Burgeon better, it's not that crazy. His cooldowns are a bit long, even though you use him because of his shorter cooldowns compared to Xiangling. His cooldowns are still a bit long for Chlorand, and his buffing is pretty small, and he's very constellation dependent. There are still times you use him over other shielders like Zhongli, but I don't think his kit really does enough to justify him being any higher. But that being said, you know, he has good teams and he's a pretty solid character. Next is Yao Yao. Essentially Dendro Traveler, but can also heal. Very good for Aggravate, very good for Nilou Bloom. Can be used on Farina teams. I think what holds her back is her healing is a little bit small if you don't spend field time on her, and you don't always want to spend field time on her. But overall pretty solid character. Doesn't need constellations to pop off, which is nice, but her constellations do some stuff. So yeah, Yao Yao, solid character. Kirara is basically the same as Yao Yao. If you can manage to not let her shield break or you can manage to refresh it and not take damage, it's really nice to have a shield instead of a heal, because that prevents interruption resistance, especially for characters like Chlorand or Yae, who get punished pretty heavily for being interrupted. Kirara is a great character. She gives some buffing herself. You kind of need her C4 to really provide the Dendro application that you kind of want for an aggravate team. But running either Sapwood Blade or the Key of Kajna suit, Instructor's Artifact set, Yao Yao can technically be a ceiling character for aggravate. Because of her buffing, she can technically be even better than Nahida. I may make a dedicated video for her here soon. We'll see how it goes. Next is Cyno. In the right conditions, Cyno is up there in tier 1 with the other great DPSs. He does a lot of damage. The main thing that holds him back is he doesn't do enough damage to compensate for his really poor multi-wave performance. But because his damage generally relies on either aggravating his hits and or creating hyperblooms, mostly he's inherently very weak to multi-wave, because Nahida is a staple for hyperbloom and you need to switch into her to reactivate her skill, and Cyno can't switch once he's in. If he could switch out, there's a decent chance he might be in tier 1. If he could switch out of his burst and refresh other characters' buffs, there's a decent chance he would move up to tier 1. But as it is, he goes down here. A lot of people don't like the way he plays. They find him clunky. I actually like the way he plays. I like his quick time event with his skill, and I think it's fun, and I think his voice lines are good. Yeah, I like Cyno. It's basically just his multi-wave that holds him back. Ayato, basically jack of all trades, master of none kind of character, but Ayato's actually pretty solid. He's good. I think his best team is Nilou teams with Baizhu. It's not a ceiling Nilou team, but it's very comfy and very good. One of my favorites. He can work for Hyperbloom as your Hydro applier. His off-field Hydro with his burst is really nice. He's one of the best for Burgeon, if not the best for Burgeon with Thoma. And you can also use a hyper carry with Farina, Bennett, Kazuha, and honestly that team actually really slaps, like really slaps. Obviously you're using the three best buffers in the game, but he does good AoE. If you're fighting AoE content, Ayato has a lot of easy to use AoE, and it's really easy to swirl Hydro on that team, and both Farina and Ayato do a lot of damage being buffed by Kazuha, and Ayato gets buffed by Bennett. And you can swap out Kazuha for Xiangling if you want to do some vape stuff. I like Ayato. I think he's actually quite a good character. I know he gets memed on a lot, but I always get really good clears with him. He's comfy and easy to play. I kind of want to even put him higher. Venti is a real tough character to place because when he's good, he's incredible, and when he's not good, he's just okay. And I think just Animo for swirling has really fallen off, so that's why he's not any higher. But when he works, he's absolutely insane because he just completely obliterates enemies and keeps them mobilized and stuff, but it's pretty rare that you can actually do that kind of thing. He also provides energy regen passive, but overall, yeah, Venti, good character. Not a character I'd recommend getting for most people, since it's just better to usually use Kazuha, and you generally, back in the old days, you'd kind of want 2 Animo characters because most of the best teams used Animo, but nowadays that's not really the case. A lot of teams don't use Animo now, so Venti is stuck to 1.5. Yae Miko is basically souped up Keqing, who's kind of feels worse to play in some scenarios because her best role is an on-field aggravate driver for official, but her on-field presence isn't very impactful and it's not very satisfying. It's still pretty good. Her damage is good. Aggravate isn't like the most highest ceiling team, and she pretty much goes toe-to-toe in team damage with Fischl, so she's not as carried as Keqing, but still she doesn't make the team work herself. She still relies on Fischl to do great damage for Aggravate, but she still has quick bloom stuff with Farina. If you want a sleeper pick team, Yae Miko, Nahida, Farina, and Xianyun is actually a sleeper pick quick bloom team and is actually really good. So if you happen to have those characters, don't recommend wishing for those characters to build this team, but if you happen to have them, give it a try. Sejuin's insane off-field healing allow you to get lots of field time for your Yae Miko to proc hyper blooms. So that's my favorite. That's the only quick bloom Yae Miko team that I actually like. So hey, give it a try. I also like Yae for Chevreuse teams, especially Arlecchino, but you can kind of do Raiden or Chlorant as well. It's not as good, but Arlecchino Yae is actually quite solid. If you use Yae and Fischl and Chevreuse, that can free you from Bennett's Circle Impact, which can be better sometimes. Not as high damage, but still good. So yeah, Yae is pretty solid. Next is Ganyu. My favorite Ganyu team these days is the Special Core Farina Bennett Xiangling. I have a whole video on that. It's quite good. And Ganyu's burst does a lot of work on this team, but her charge attacks are giga buffed. Sometimes you're gonna melt, sometimes you're gonna freeze, sometimes Farina's gonna vape, sometimes Xiangling's gonna melt, sometimes Ganyu's gonna melt, and overall, everyone's being buffed on the team, everyone's doing damage, and it's really quite good. It doesn't rely as much on getting tons and tons of charge attacks out like Ganyu's traditional melt teams. If you can just get a couple out, and even if you get knocked around once or twice, you still do so much damage that you're totally fine to clear. And oftentimes because of Xiangling's long pyro, like good pyro application, you actually are gonna melt with Ganyu. It's easily my favorite Ganyu team these days, and it's one that keeps her, like, it still shows off her DPS potential, but also just having a solid team overall. That being said, she's kind of carried on that team, and I know she has other teams. I know she has Melt with Zhongli and Xiangling Bennett, but that team for me is too inconsistent to really play. Like, if you miss a charge shot or two, like, your damage just falls right off a cliff. A lot of times the boss these days is melting the hit on Zhongli's shield and potentially breaking it. And if your shield gets broken, you get knocked around, your DPS just falls off a cliff. I personally can't get very good clears with traditional melt Ganyu, and freeze Ganyu is very rarely good. Mono cryo is all right. It's pretty solid. With Shenhe Layla Kazuha, I get in AoE, it's actually quite good. I quite like it, but it's more of a tier 2 team. It's not really a higher tier team. So I think that this is Ganyu's best team right now, and I think she does quite well in it. I'm gonna put Ayaka right above her. Obviously Ayaka has traditional freeze, and traditional freeze you can get some good damage even in single target. You can get some good damage. You can do Bennett Shenhe Kazuha for bossing with Ayaka. You can do the same for Farina Bennett Xiangling team. The raw damage that these characters have is really high, but freeze was the best thing cryo had for a long time, and without freeze being good, it just hasn't been good for so long. It's a treat when freeze is good for even 1 or 2 chambers of an abyss side. So that's what keeps these guys out of tier 1, but they're still solid. They still do good damage. Next is Cutie Pie Klee. Klee on Farina teams is quite good. Klee in Monopyro is quite good. Klee Burgeon is alright. There's a lot of people who will see this Klee placement and think she's way too high. But honestly, with peak clears in the right content, she can go even higher. I don't know why people think Klee is bad exactly. Like, she is kind of annoying to play, but she's not that annoying to play. Like, certainly not more annoying to use than on-field Yae Miko. I don't know. Klee does good damage. She's pretty good. I get pretty good clears with Klee. She's definitely not as good as a bunch of other pyro characters we're gonna see, but Klee's a good DPS. I don't know what you want to say. I don't know what you want me to say. Chiori is one of my disappointment characters. I hope in the future that constructs can make her better. I think this puts her the lowest Fontaine 5-star release. Oh, except for Sejuin, which is a shame. One of my favorite designs. She, if you think about it, she does like kind of similar damage to Yelan, but she requires another construct to kind of out damage Yelan. And even then, I don't even really think she does. Obviously, it highly depends on the team that we're talking about for Yelan, but often you're running Yelan with Farina and stuff like that. And Yelan gives a pretty decent buff to the on-field character, and Chiori doesn't buff anything at all. I would have really liked to see them put some more scaling into her kit, just more damage, less restrictive, I guess, but mostly I just would like to see more damage or a buff, just a geo damage buff to the on-field character maybe. She's basically got Navia teams and Ito teams, and in Navia she's barely an upgrade unless you have her C1, and in Ito she is best in slot, but Ito, you know, he's not an insane character. Hopefully Hoyo's got a plan and more geo is coming, and that could definitely raise the value of Chiori, but for right now she goes here. Why is she here then if I've did nothing but dunk on her? She still does do good damage. You know, Zhongli Chiori is still a great core. Like, you can put Zhongli Chiori with Arlecchino and it does quite well. It's very, very comfortable. You can put Zhongli Chiori with Linny. That's one of my favorite. That's my favorite shielded Linny comp. So like she has a bunch of teams and uses that are suboptimal but still solid, and that's what tier 1.5 is basically suboptimal but solid. Child. Tartaglia is really good, but it takes a lot of resets to really get good clears. You can easily die, you can easily mess up, you can miss your timings, you can miss your rotations. If you really min-max a child, you can get some clears that are still up tippity top, but for most people, most of the time, he's gonna be worse than Ayato on this list, right? Like if you were to put me in the abyss and say make an abyss run and choose either child or Ayato, and you can choose whatever team you want and your goal is to get the fastest clear possible, but every time you die you can restart, but it still counts as your time. Like I'm gonna choose Ayato, even if I'm allowed like only 1 or 2 resets, for example, and it'll just count the best time. I'm gonna choose Ayato because he's just easier to play. He's more consistent. Child, you know, he would be higher if he had like maybe a bit of a lower damaging team, but it was much easier to play. But no, his only great team is pretty hard to play. And I know you can use him in Burgeon, you can use him in Nilou, you can use him in Taser, just like other Hydro characters, but he really underperforms in these teams versus other Hydro characters, including Ayato, because he doesn't have any off-field. And the Bursty Hydro, well, it can be really, really good, and you can get some crazy stuff. It's very, like, meme-y or screenshot-y, but still a good character under the right circumstance, and definitely still, hey, 1.5, pretty solid tier anyways. Next we have Gaming. Very, very, very similarly to Child. Strictly speaking, sheet DPS, Gaming is definitely deserves to be higher, so hey, if you're a dedicated Gaming main, then he can be higher, but I can really only judge the characters at my personal skill level, and I did spend a bunch of time playing Gaming, and I did get some good clears with him, but it was inconsistent. And inconsistency is very hard to measure on a tier list. It's like, do I put them high, but have an asterisk that they're inconsistent, or do I put them low, or do I put them somewhere in the middle? And that's kind of where I'm going, is I'm bringing him down because of his inconsistency, but a real dedicated main could push Gaming higher, especially if you're willing to reset. But he does crazy damage, and whether or not you have Xianyun, he can still do crazy damage. He can do crazy melt stuff. The melt thing is totally circle impact to the nth degree, though, needing Diona, Rosaria, and Bennett to properly melt. Yeah, Gaming good but inconsistent, and this is a pretty good spot for him. Next is Diluc, who is basically the worst Gaming, but he's just a little easier to play. He's a little more consistent, and I consistently get better clear times with Diluc than Gaming, except for the occasional one where Gaming is way higher. So that's what it is for me. But Diluc, he does have some melt stuff as well, which is very hard to play and is actually pretty good. You can look up melt Diluc clears on YouTube, and there's some crazy stuff. Diluc has some good melt stuff that doesn't need Farina, but the Farina Bennett Xianyun core is really good. It is very circle impacty. It's not as circle impacty if you're able to use Diluc's burst, which gives him a pyro infusion outside of Bennett's circle. You can even do a double hydro infusion in strictly single target, or in times where you can stay in Bennett's circle. Again, his teams can even go higher. So yeah, Diluc getting close to the higher spots of tier 1.5. Next is going to be Wriothesley, and yeah, I do think Wriothesley is the best cryo character. I do think he's a little better than Ganyu and Ayaka these days. Not a ton better, right? All of these characters. Hey, I'm gonna be real with you. If you want to move Yae Miko up to the front, if you want to put Ayato up to the front of this tier, you know, if you want to put Sino at the front of this tier, I'm totally fine with that. Like, the individual placements within the tier are much less important to me. Or if characters that are right at the top, you think that they go in above, or characters right at the bottom, you think they go below, that's totally fine with me as well. But by and large, I do think Wriothesley is a little better than the other two. Because he has that Farina Bennett Xianyun core, and I do think that is his best team. But he also has some melt stuff. He also has some, like, the burn melt stuff. Bennett Xianyun Zhongli is much more consistent, or Bennett Xianyun, I don't know what, Kazuha, if you get Crow Swirl in there. It's kind of hard to do, but you can do it. He's got some more stuff that's like a little bit better than the more stuff that Ayaka and Ganyu has, and he's a little bit more synergistic with the Farina Bennett Xianyun team, so that's why he is taking the higher spot. In terms of clear times, I've gotten pretty much the same with all of them. I think Rise is just a little bit more comfortable and more easy to play, and that puts him higher. Second to highest spot is Jean. I hemmed and hawed about putting Jean in tier 1. I definitely think that that's a reasonable take. Jean with Raiden teams, Raiden double hydro with Farina Yelan, Jean. She's pretty good on Nouvellette teams with Furina when you don't need grouping from Kazuha. Increasing those fanfare stacks is good. Generally, just doing good things with Furina, Jean does. She also has the over vape stuff, Sunfire over vape, where you replace Xianyun with her to get that power application through the synergy with Bennett's burst. Good for shield breaking. Obviously has VV. Overall, I think Jean is pretty good. The more I'm talking about it, the more I kind of want to put her up higher. I'll think about it more at the end. Right above her, I do have Sucrose. Both Sucrose and Jean could easily go in tier 1. I'll look at how many characters I have in tier 1 and think about if I want to move them up. But Sucrose is good in aggravate. She can drive national. Sucrose aggravate with Cloran, where she can pass Thrilling Tales. Really, really nice. But she's also good in Arlecchino Vape. Again, passing Thrilling Tales, sharing EM. Technically higher single target damage than Kazuha for both of those teams. The thing is, the lack of grouping does fall off, and just feeling a bit clunky to play puts her down a little bit. But again, tier 1.5 and tier 1, the whole point of them is that they're very, very close. So very top of tier 1.5, it's basically tier 1 at that point. Next is going to be Kokomi, and Kokomi will be our first tier 1 character. She's best in slot for Nilou teams, and driving Yelan, Furina, Kazuha is really, really good. She has some interruption resistance. She actually does personal damage on that team. You can do like more cope stuff like Hyper Bloom Reversion and stuff, which I don't really recommend, but you can do it, and at least she has that option. I don't really like Taser, but it's something you can do. I know she's also just a general comfortable pick as a driver. If she had better off-field healing, I think I would put her even higher, but it's still solid. It's still reasonably good. So I think Kokomi very much earns her spot in tier 1. Next is going to be Baizhu. It's kind of crazy. Baizhu is consistently one of the top picks for every Abyss rotation in terms of percentage owned and used, and I get it. I really like using Baizhu as a character. He's most often used on Novelette Furina teams as a very, very comfortable pick, because with C0 Novelette, you want some interruption resistance, and Baizhu gives just enough interruption resistance to be very, very useful. In addition, if your shield would have got broken as Zhongli, it can't be brought back unless you switch back into Zhongli, whereas Baiju's refreshes automatically. So there are times where very strong infrequent hits from the enemy come, and Baizhu will be more sustaining for interruption resistance than Zhongli, which is really, really cool. He's obviously best in slot on aggravate. He's one of the comfiest options for Nilou teams, and he's also just generally a good support for Furina teams. Furina, Yelan, Baizhu as a core, and then you use like a pyro like Hu Tao as the lead. That's a really, really good team. Baiju's got a lot of stuff, and he's very comfortable, very easy to use. I like Baizhu a lot. Okay, so now we move into the part of the tier list that everyone is super, super scrunched up and close together. The rest of tier 1, in my opinion, depending on who you are, depending on the content that you're fighting and your preferred playstyle, I could easily see you putting these next characters in basically any order. So even though I'm going to give my personal order of how I would order them, just know that in my head they're so close, and just different types of content and different personal playstyles can mangle any of these up very, very much. So if you're saying, oh no, Cloran shouldn't be higher than Wanderer, blah, 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 that's totally fine, and I don't really object to that. So next is going to be Wanderer. I think Wanderer is really quite good. He's got good single target. He's got good AoE. He can work with Kazuha. You do obviously need to have farts on. A lot of people find they need a shielder, especially against aggressive enemies. And when you need a shielder, his performance goes down considerably, in my opinion. Thoma's probably his best shielder, but Layla is also great. And even Zhongli, Chiori is pretty good too. If you can get away without a shielder and use Furina, Bennett, or Shangling, or Yelan, or someone else like that, that can be really good too. But he's very strong, he's very flexible. If you end up getting constellations of him going for Farazan, even better. But personally, I find that whenever you get hit, you just get knocked to the other end of the Abyss Chamber, and that really makes him more inconsistent. But again, from here on, I consider all of these DPSs very, very close, but I'm putting Wanderer last mostly because of his lack of comfort and inconsistency. Next is Xianyun. Xianyun, obviously her best use is for Zhao, but she has other great teams too. She can support Raiden Double Hydro with Thrilling Tales. She can obviously support Hu Tao. I actually consistently get faster clears with my Navia Plunge than my Zhao, even though my Zhao is built pretty well. Diluc Plunge just general plunge teams, gumming, Xianyun has some really good teams. She can also be a decent DPS herself, and I find most of all her teams very comfortable to play. I know plunge, depending on what device you're on and what you find fun, can be a little cringe, at least on controller. I find plunge very comfortable, especially if you're using a claymore. The dash cancels are pretty easy, and you can also just use her as a Jean, as an animal healer for Novelette teams, for whatever. So overall, yeah, Xianyun is good. Zhao is next. I really like Zhao. I especially like his comfortability and easy to play. He's obviously got better AoE than a lot of characters, and in certain AoE instances, Zhao is a top DPS. So that's why I'm saying, like, you know, any of these characters, depending on the abyss, depending on the circumstances, could be a lot higher, and Zhao definitely can. His single target's quite good too. In my personal testing, he doesn't clear as well as the other characters that are above him on this list, but I really like his comfortability. And in the past, like a while ago, people have said that he really wants a shielder, but I found using Farina, Xianyun, and Farazan to be very comfortable. It's very rare I get knocked out of my plunges, and he has quite a few different teams as well. So overall, I really like Zhao. I think he's very good. And of course, both of these characters would not be in this tier at all if it weren't for Farazan. Farazan is the best out of these characters, in my opinion, because yeah, the DPSs otherwise would just be in tier 1.5. And sure, she does need some sort of animo DPS to function, right? You can't use Farazan without using an anime DPS, an animo DPS, an anime DPOS is what I was going to say. But in my opinion, she's really what makes the team. And so that's why I put her just a bit higher than the other two. Granted, she does need her C6 to be this high. Again, I'll be putting little asterisks and images on the final version. There's going to be like a little legend where R is going to be requires another character, C is going to be requires a constellation, and S requires skill to play, and we're gonna have like little asterisks for a bunch of these characters, and you'll just check out the tactor link to see that final ranking with those little asterisks. But Farazan's definitely one that requires constellations, but if you have them, then she is the animo DPS. All of these characters, another thing that kind of holds them back a little bit is their performance with 4-star weapons versus 5-star weapons. As you can see, I mix both 5-star and 4-star weapon performance, and these guys' performance falls off a little bit, but then again, pretty much all of the characters on this list, especially above here, really value their 5-star weapons, so it's not really unique to them, but it is a little bit of a factor anyways. Hu Tao is going to be next. I used to have Hu Tao even higher, and the main reason I've personally put her a little lower is just that her AoE performance is not crazy. She has better AoE when you're using Plunge Hu Tao, and you can definitely use Cosmo Bennett, Yelan, or something like that to fix some AoE, but the Abyss has been more and more AoE heavy as of recently, and although Hu Tao's AoE is fine-ish, it's not great. So that's why she's kind of gone down for me personally. Being a single target DPS queen is not as valuable as it used to be. She still gets crazy numbers. She's still a top tier DPS. She does also require mechanical skill to play the combos. I don't find the combos that bad, even at C0. Obviously C1 is a lot more fun, but even at C0, she's totally fine. And this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, right? Is if you value single target specifically more, then Hu Tao shoots up this list to near the top. So it really just depends. And if you value E more than Zhao does that. So Hu Tao, one of the top characters, but she's gotten a lot better through Fontaine. Hydro Resonance change was actually huge for her. Farina Yelan as a core for a Hu Tao team is huge. You can do Farina Yelan Jean, you can do Farina Yelan Baizhu for a few versions here and there, you can do Farina Yelan Xianyun, you can do Farina Yelan Bennett, and you can do the usual double Hydro Zhongli with just Xingqiu Yelan, but her teams have definitely gotten a nice big buff from Fontaine. And I'm actually going to put the next character, Linny, just one spot behind her. Sorry for the fake out there. Linny has better AoE, and he has great single target. Peak Linny actually can go up to even C0 or your tier 0. Like if you really peak your Linny. But the thing is, he's very challenging to max out, especially at C0. Even with his 5-star weapon, he's challenging to max out. If you have a C1 and his 5-star weapon, that helps a lot because he gains more stacks. If you have a C2, even better. Moving his damage from just his charge attack into from his burst with his constellations is super valuable. Without that, I tend to struggle very hard at getting consistent clears. I can get clears occasionally. I've had insane clears where he's just as strong as tier 0 DPSs, but because it's so difficult to make happen with C0R0 or C0R1, I have a hard time with it. And his shielded teams, although they're fine, they're nothing special, but still a great character. Raiden Shogun is a character where she lacks in absolute peak potential. She really shows up in team versatility. You've got Raiden National, and by the way, the Yelan version is better than Xingqiu. You've got Hyper Bloom. Don't play Raiden Hyper Bloom, but you know you can play Raiden Hyper Bloom. But you've got Raiden Double Hydro with Furina, Yelan, and either Jean or Xianyun. For a team like that, she's really utilizing her supportive capabilities to reduce Yelan's ER, so that Yelan can almost be one of the main DPSs of that team. I think she does more damage than Raiden, especially if Yelan has her signature weapon. You've also got like the usual quick bloom teams where you use her as in kind of Sinos teams with Furina, Baizhu, Nahida. That team is quite good. You've got Aggravate, which is not as good, but it is a team. And then you've got Chevreuse, which is actually really, really great. The fewer rotations you have to do, the better, because Xiangling's cooldowns really hurt the team actually. So waiting for Xiangling to come off of cooldown really kind of kills your DPS. So if you're able to 1 rotate or 2 rotate a wave, she can kind of outperform her sheet DPS. And more than all of that I just said, she's immeasurably comfortable. She's unbelievably comfortable. Having infinite poise and infinite interruption resistance, and all those teams I mentioned are played with a strong healer. So she just never gets interrupted. And this is a luxury that very, 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 very few characters have. It's as if she has a Zhongli on her team without, as long as she has a healer, you essentially have a Zhongli on your team. I forgot you can also just run like hyper carry with Furina, Bennett, Kazuha, which is really quite good as well. So where she might lack in peak power, she remains very, very strong in flexibility, like account value, and just comfort and easy to play. It's much easier to max out Raiden's teams than it is to max out basically any other DPS, except for certain DPSs that already use Zhongli on their best teams, which there aren't very many of. Most of the time, Zhongli is a sacrifice. You sacrifice some DPS for some more consistency. Raiden never has to make a sacrifice like that. So that's why Raiden deserves a pretty high spot in my opinion. And depending on how high you value that, you can either push her up, and if you don't value that, you can push her down. That's what I'm talking about. All of these characters can be intermingled, and you won't hear me complaining. Speaking of comfortable and strong characters, next is Navia. Another character that outperforms what her sheet DPS would tell you. Being able to get 3 skills into her first rotation really can make her performance better than it would be if the HP pools of the Abyss were much higher. Requiring Crystallize to function makes her inherently tanky and resistant to interruption, even without running someone like Zhongli. Traditionally extremely good in single target, using Bennett as one of her main cores, but also having Furina, Xianyun plunge gives her more AoE. She's not tied to specific rotations. You're free to use her normals or plunges to finish off enemies while waiting for the new wave to unload the skill nukes. You can freely switch out to other characters to fix your crystallizes, battery, be flexible with the Bennett buff. She definitely thrives more in single target, but has reasonably okay enough performance, like at least like definitely better than the likes of Hu Tao. So yeah, I think Navia is quite good. Xiangling. Xiangling is pretty weird. More and more and more, she's kind of relegated to like a supportive role, like providing pyro, because there's so many teams where we want pyro application, but we just don't have any off-field pyro application that's consistent except for Xiangling. So she ends up being shoehorned into teams that she doesn't really belong in. And with the release of more and more pyro DPSs with Linny and Arlecchino, and some of those being some of the strongest DPSs in the game, a lot of people are kind of using Xiangling less, and her long cooldowns are becoming more of a problem for a bunch of teams. So her flaws are kind of showing a lot more than they used to. She was always relied on Bennett, but now there's a lot of teams where you want to run her without a Bennett team, and you have to build ungodly amounts of ER to make that happen. She is showing her weaknesses, and it's pretty fascinating because some people are going to put her way up at the top, maybe even in tier 0, and some people actually unironically think she belongs in the tier below, in tier 1.5. I kind of feel like Xiangling is still quite good. I end up using her on quite a few Abyss runs, and I've kind of settled on just like a pretty, like an ER Sans with the catch kind of build as like a generalist build, and she does decent damage and has lots of ER, and I generally find that pretty comfy and pretty usable. But just the fact that you kind of put her on so many teams when you need to fix them, or you put Xiangling with Raiden on a bunch of teams, you put Xiangling with Navia on a bunch of teams, you put her with Linny for monopyre, you can put her with Zhao, you can put her with Wanderer. That happens pretty often. You put her with Wriothesley, you know, you put her with Chevreuse. Like, she goes with so many teams. So even if you want to say she's kind of fallen off, she still goes with so many teams that, you know, depending on how I'm feeling, I want to put her higher or put her lower. So Xiangling, amazing. You do need your C4 to make her work. Next, we have Kuki Shinobu. And yes, I have slightly adjusted my placements for my 4 stars after my top 11 4-star videos. I did say I was very unsure with the ranking of certain characters in that video, and as long as you switch around these certain ones, I'm perfectly fine with. And like I said, all of these are very in flux depending on the content, depending on the reasoning being used. But Kuki consolidating Hyperbloom trigger and being your healer is just so valuable. Hyperbloom is a team that used to be regarded as like the savior of free-to-plays, and now you kind of still need one of the, like, Hyperbloom is still amazing and still easy, but you kind of need one of the better Hyperblooms. It doesn't just carry as a reaction all by itself. You need one of the better Hyperbloom teams. That being said, I think Kuki is always better than Raiden in Hyperbloom because she consolidates the healings, except for, you know, Chlorand Hyperbloom, because Chlorand consolidates the healing as well, but that's not really relevant to Kuki versus Raiden. Raiden has like very niche advantages over Kuki Hyperbloom, which that it can proc from farther away, which is sort of useful when you're using Novelette Hyperbloom. I don't personally see a huge value in that. I would much rather just have more heals. And Kuki has a still pretty decently sized range, and you're still going to be usually decently close to the enemy that you'll always proc your blooms without really a problem. Raiden also buffs burst damage when she uses a Hyperbloom trigger, which is good for specifically double Hydro Hyperbloom, where she buffs both Yelan and Xingqiu. And sure, if you can get away without a healer at all on that team and do Nahida, Raiden, Xingqiu, Yelan, then Raiden definitely is an upgrade, but I don't think most people can get away with an on-field Nahida and not have any sort of healing at all. So I think in general, Kuki is just the better choice. She only needs her C2. Not really relevant for her ranking on the list, but just worthy of noting. Kuki's also sees use on Alhaitham spread teams as a support holder of either Sapwood Blade or Key of Kajna Suit and Instructor's Artifact set. She also sees some use on Novelette teams, where she provides some electrocharge damage for AoE scenarios overall, and just additional healing for Farina to top off those stacks. So overall, Kuki, awesome character, very good. Next, I have Fischl. So first, the positives. Fischl, similar to Xiangling, just ends up showing up in a lot of teams. Obviously, she is the Aggravate archetype, except that Aggravate archetype, like, Aggravate's never really a top team, so I don't think that's really fair, but she's also sort of most people's default choice for Alhaitham spread. Even though Yae Miko is better, people generally gravitate towards Fischl because it's easier to obtain than Yae Miko for a lot of especially older players. You're also just going to see Fischl slapped into a lot of flex teams, especially when you need electro or you just need elemental application. She has very low animations. She provides energy to your team. She's good with Chevreuse as well, but she's not like part of ceiling damage of very many super top meta teams. Her value is more about her flexibility than it is about her pure power, generally speaking. But yeah, I still think she's very strong and makes a solid name for herself at the higher end of tier 1. Next is gonna be Nilou, the very best character in the game in the right circumstances, but those circumstances don't always happen. She is also unusable in very specific circumstances, and those are also very rare to happen. So she's one of the swingiest characters on this list. She can feel absolutely godlike or solid. That being said, I definitely want to put some respect on Nilou's name and acknowledge that, yeah, in the right content, she's insane. She's generally been power crept by Novelette because her best scenarios was AoE, and Novelette just has much easier AoE, and he works in more types of AoE. Like, because there's AoE and then there's like different types of AoE. Nilou works in a specific type of AoE. So she has higher highs and lower lows than a lot of DPSs, but her highs are so high that you have to put respect, and her lows are not that low. She's still usable in pretty much any content, even single target content. It's just like cryo and dendro shields that she can't do anything with. Her signature weapon is absolutely insane for her, and so we're mixing her signature weapon performance with not. I only very recently got her signature weapon, and I was actually surprised. I didn't like blow me away as much as I thought it would, because you always hear of how impactful the signature weapon is. It didn't like floor me the way that I thought it would. It made me like her Farina teams a lot more. I really like Nilou, Farina, Baizhu, Nahida a lot more than I did before I got the key. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, Nilou, insane character. Next is going to be Alhaitham. Yes, I have committed the cardinal sin and I put Alhaitham below Chlorand. We'll talk about Chlorand in a minute. But again, if you want to put Alhaitham above Chlorand and above all these, totally fine. Alhaitham is amazing, especially since he works so well in Hyperbloom, and Hyperbloom is one of the most free-to-play friendly comps, and Alhaitham, frankly, is just a way more comfortable driver than Nahida is, and he has better AoE. He fixes the AoE. He also has spread. He also has the Farina variant, which is very, very good. Alhaitham is an excellent DPS, especially a free-to-play DPS. His signature weapon doesn't do that much for him, and frankly, he's probably, if you don't count 5-star weapons at all, and if you just count 4-star weapons, he definitely beats Chlorand. Definitely. Chlorand gets a lot from having a 5-star weapon, a lot more than Alhaitham does, and since I'm kind of weighing a bit of both, that's why Alhaitham ends up here. But he's very good. He doesn't have synergy with Kazuha, which hurts his AoE performance a little, but he still does have solid AoE. He has solid front load for bursting down some bosses with his burst. He has great multi-wave because he has flexible rotations. You can switch out, switch back in. He's basically anything you could want out of a DPS, and he's pretty comfortable and pretty easy to play. You got to keep an eye on his like mirrors mechanic, but it's not that hard to do, and you can kind of dodge whenever you want, similar to like Arlecchino, where you don't need to finish specific combos to get your max damage. He's just all in all an awesome DPS. And next is Chlorand, and this is sort of a self-report because I do simp for Chlorand, but at the same time, I consistently, very consistently, every single abyss, regardless of the blessing, regardless of whether it's the Imaginarium Theater, right now it's not the Imaginarium Theater, and she just got my best first side clear for both Megukinki and the first chamber, which is that horrible multi-wave with the Eremites at the end. She consistently gets my best or my second best clear for basically every abyss. She has so much Electro with the Overload team that she can get a great clear on the second half. She's not restricted to just Aggravate. Yes, she has Aggravate, and her Aggravate is technically her peak team, but Farina Nahida Flex is super, super good as well, and you can put Fischl there, but she's not tied to Fischl. You can put Mona there with Thrilling Tales. That's super good. And her Chevreuse teams, if you have C6 Chevreuse, are absolutely out of this world, but not everyone does, but you don't need it, because you've got the Farina teams, you've got the Aggravate teams, and you've got the Chevreuse teams. And she's not carried by Fischl on the Aggravate teams. She does more damage than Fischl. In fact, in certain content, Kujosara can be better, although generally I definitely prefer Fischl and will choose Fischl every time personally, but in certain content, Kujosara can be better. So what do we call a DPS? Like for me, from my perspective, right? What do I do with a DPS? And I know that I bias towards Chlorand, right? I know that mentally, so I'm trying to adjust for that. I'm trying to not put Raiden too high. I'm trying to not put Navia too high. I'm trying to not put Shenhe and yoimiya too high, or Chiori too high, because I know I have a bias towards liking these characters and wanting them to be good. But Chlorand is a character that I consistently get the best clear times with on a wide variety of different teams that use completely different units. This to me says she's a great DPS. Now, she does have some downsides. If you're fighting very aggressive enemies, you want to use Zhongli or Kirara, but Kirara is not really that much of a damage loss, actually. So that's totally fine. In fact, technically, Kirara, if you can grab the Sapwood Blade Leaf, or if you have Key of Kajna Suit, she can be just as good as Nahida on an Aggravate team. And using Thoma makes for a very, very comfortable team for Chevreuse, and using Zhongli on the Farina Nahida team is quite good, actually, because he buffs Electro, Dendro, and Hydro. So you get resistance shred for all three elements. So he's actually a pretty good fourth slot. She's good in single target. She's pretty good in AoE because her bullet is intangible and hits enemies all in a line. She's great in multi-wave. She's great in single wave, but I totally get she has drawbacks as well. If you're not playing with a shielder, she can easily get knocked around. You can lose a lot of damage. If you have high ping, you're not going to be able to get her full combo off, and that's going to knock her down. She's not, I just want to say this, right? Again, even though I've said it all through this entire row, she's not better than Alhaitham. She's not better than Nilou. She's not better than Navia or Hu Tao or Linny or Zhao or Wanderer or any of these characters. Different abysses, different cycles, different pilots will adjust how a character feels to you. To me, she feels better, but they're all so close that not one of these characters, in my opinion, is better than the others. It just comes down to content and player preference, in my opinion. Next is going to be Xingqiu. Now, I kind of made the argument in my 4-star ranking video that because Xingqiu was basically power crept hard by Novelette, Farina, Yelan, and he needs his C6 and blah, 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 that he kind of goes lower than these other 4-stars. But the reality is he does add something, which is comfort that Yelan doesn't, like more comfort. It is more comfortable to play a team with Xingqiu than Yelan. Sometimes the Hydro application can make up for his lack of damage. And yes, especially on the Farina teams, the lack of damage is noticeable, but there are times where people prefer Xingqiu, like Alhaitham, Hyper Bloom, people often prefer Xingqiu for the extra comfort. With Hu Tao, people often prefer Xingqiu. For Arlecchino, I personally prefer Xingqiu for AoE vaping, because you can hug up to enemies and get AoE vapes, whereas Yelan doesn't have that option. So despite that, I think he is noticeably worse, especially now with Farina and Novelette. I think he's noticeably worse than Yelan. I do think he's still pretty high, and I'm not going to disrespect him by putting him too much lower. Chevreuse does need her C6 to be this high. Without C6, I don't know. She probably still cracks tier 1, but maybe it's tier 1.5 at the top of tier 1.5. Having a bigger buff than Kazuha at C6, both the damage buff and the resistance shred, and she gives an attack buff to both Electro and Pyro, and you don't have to do anything to refresh the buff between waves, and she heals. What kind of character is this? This character is crazy. It's crazy. It blows my mind how good this character is. At C0, she's really quite good, and at C6, she's downright stupid. She is the bait that Hoyoverse is saving, and people are going to wish on her banner just to get copies of her, and she is like, yeah, this major bait. I don't know how this character got out of the development in this state. She's truly broken. I really do want to put her in tier 0, but right now we don't quite have the teams to really justify it, and mostly it's Xiangling that holds her back, because what we need to really have tier 0 pop off is a better Fischl, and Yae Miko is not a better Fischl, she's kind of a different Fischl, and a better Xiangling, and that is what holds Chevreuse back from being in tier 0. I think the Pyro Archon and potentially a future off-field Electro could push Chevreuse easily into the tier 0 character, and could push her pretty high into tier 0, depending on how the Pyro Archon might synergize with Chevreuse, depending on maybe we get a Pyro Sovereign, maybe we get a Bennett side grade, a Xiangling side grade, official upgrade. I could see Chevreuse going higher. Insane character. Next is Zhongli, the big king of Geo himself. He has gotten a lot better throughout Fontaine. He is no longer a damage loss because teams like Novelette actually use him on the best teams. He's not really a damage loss for Navia. Let's go through all of the teams, right? Novelette, he's best in slot. Arlecchino, best in slot for comfort. I generally don't use him with Arlecchino, but if it's an aggressive Abyss, I'll definitely bust out Zhongli. Clorand, I like at least one of the teams he's quite good on. Alhaitham, best in slot option for spread. Nilou, no. Raiden, no. Hu Tao, one of the most comfortable picks. Linny, comfort pick. Zhao, comfort pick. Wanderer, comfort pick, but usually not the best. So overall, he is just the king of comfort and consistency clears. And because I don't just value peak damage, I value overall comfortability and consistency, I'm happy to put Zhongli at the top of tier 1. I don't think he quite hits tier 0 just because I've tried my best to save tier 0 for just the tippity top of the meta, but he comes pretty close. If he was like best in slot for Arlecchino, or maybe a couple more of the upper characters, like if he was best in slot for Arlecchino and Hu Tao and stuff like that, then maybe he bumps up, but as it is, I think he goes right here. Speaking of the Knave, we've talked about her a lot. She is the first character to go in tier 0. This is the first tier list that I'm putting DPSs in tier 0. I think DPSs of Fontaine are truly a different breed. They pull up an entire team of bad characters by being a great DPS. That is the hallmark of a tier 0 DPS. She pulls up Candice from the depths of hell and carries her on her back as a good character. No, that's not all it is, but she's just on another level, in my opinion. It is kind of just barely on another level. She's not head and shoulders above the other characters, but Arlecchino also has the claim to fame of just having the best theoretical damage, period, basically. I think technically maybe Linny can even be better, but practically you can actually get that theoretical damage. I played not even a VV Vape setup, just Yelan, Mona, Bennett, and I was getting 230k normal attack, which is just absolutely nuts. Not even Swirl. Now, of course, she doesn't consistently do those throughout the whole rotation. It's only at the very beginning where her Bond of Life is maxed out and blah blah blah. But still, I do truly think she belongs in tier 0. She has Vape, which I think is my favorite VV Vape, but you also have, you know, double Hydro Zhongli, single Hydro Bennett Zhongli, mono Pyro with Bennett Zhongli, Kazuha. If you want more comfortable, you've got lots and lots and lots of options. She has decent-ish, like decent AoE, enough to get by. Not crazy AoE, not as good as even a bunch of other characters in the lower, but it's good. I think one of my favorite parts about her is kind of what I already talked about with Alhaitham, is you don't have to execute specific combos to make her damage happen. If you have to dodge, it's no big deal, you just dodge. The only hard part about Arlecchino is just not getting hit, and generally speaking, she's reasonably tanky as well with her passive. So yeah, I find myself very consistently getting banger clears with Arlecchino. My best clears is generally always going to be either Neuvillette, Arlecchino, or Clorinde. Those are my top 3 general best clears. And she's got, like I said, lots of teams. Chevreuse, I can't remember if I mentioned, but yeah. And I think she could get even better with Pyro Archon and extra stuff. So yeah. Bennett, despite falling off in usage rates, there's great teams that don't have Bennett on them these days, he is still a truly ridiculous character. The attack buff, it's kind of like everything I said about Chevreuse almost applies to Bennett, except Chevreuse has even more quality of life, but Bennett just has a higher buff. The attack buff is stupid. The fact that he heals is stupid. The fact that he works with Farina if you just build more HP is stupid. That's one of the nice things about Arlecchino, by the way, is that she doesn't need Farina. So if you have Farina on your other side, she doesn't need it. All the good DPSs don't need Farina, but Arlecchino doesn't. It says take Farina away. But for Bennett, like, we looked through best in slot for Arlecchino, best in slot for a lot of Chevreuse teams, technically best in slot for Clorinde, although I will play Thoma over him because she doesn't use the full attack buff anyways. Can work with Alhaitham, not best in slot, but sometimes it can actually work. Obviously, Xiangling needs it. Technically best in slot for Navia single target, best in slot for a lot of Raiden teams, technically best in slot for some Hu Tao teams, best in slot for Linny, technically best in slot for Zhao, but worse for Comfort, technically best in slot for Wanderer. A lot of them are technically. Hopefully you didn't take a shot every time I said technically or you're on the floor right now. So I definitely agree, like, he's not as insane as he was. And that's why he's not like number 2 on the list. But I still think he's very, very strong and makes up the core of some really, 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 really broken teams. Kazuha has gone from being possibly the best character in the game, and he's fallen a few spots, actually. Not that I think he's worse, but he's definitely not needed on nearly as many teams. Chevreuse being added, and especially Farina being added. Farina gives such a high damage bonus that, along with other supports and other characters, can make up for the fact that you're not shredding the resistance of the enemy. You don't always need to shred resistance to do damage anymore. There's lots of raw damage and raw reaction teams that you don't always need Kazuha anymore. A bunch of characters don't need Kazuha as their best teams anymore. And with characters like Neuvillette, yeah, like Neuvillette wants Kazuha on his best team for sure, but a lot of characters just do their AoE differently, and they don't necessarily need a character like Kazuha to do AoE. When Kazuha is great, he's great. He's kind of like Venti in that way, where when there's Kazuha content, when the enemies are just grouped up, just at the right distance away, he can magically make clears that were failing be awesome and clears that were good be insane because of his grouping. His grouping is still second to none, absolutely crazy. The damage bonus, if you get constellations, he shares EM, but don't bother getting constellations because they're much weaker compared to new constellations like Farina. I love Kazuha, but there's constantly more and more different options that make you not need to have him. I used to always run Kazuha and Sucrose, or Kazuha and Venti for my Abyss runs. Now there's plenty of Abysses that I don't even use Kazuha. It used to be that every top team used Kazuha, and now there's just lots more options. We've gotten lots of strong characters and there's more options. So Kazuha still insane, but other stuff is also insane. Next is Neuvillette. Crazy AoE, can hit basically the entire chamber all at once, and I don't even use the spin to win trick. Solid, like quite good single target performance. Quite a great variety of teams. Doesn't need a specific support or teams to prop him up. Definitely wants Farina, but he can absolutely use a different Hydro. You can use a different Hydro character or no Hydro characters. He's basically just too easy to play for the kind of AoE and the kind of damage he does. Like, he does comparable single target to pretty much every character in the game, to the point where you can easily clear any single target DPS check easily, while also having insane AoE, while also healing himself, while also synergizing with Zhongli, or Baizhu, some of the best defensive characters in the game, meaning that even if you don't have C1, you still have interruption resistance on his best team, even at C0. Absolutely crazy. Add to that Hydra is a great element, so you can run with Hyper Bloom, you can do some weird vape stuff, you can do the traditional hyper carry, and he's the one that carries this team. It's not the supports that carry him, he carries the team. So yeah, next is Nahida. I'm actually going to move Nahida below Kazuha. First, the positives. Nahida is Dendro the character. Basically, all Dendro teams want Nahida nowadays. Even the best Aggravate now wants Nahida with Chlorand. Hyper Bloom needs Nahida, Nilou needs Nahida, Alhaitham doesn't need Nahida, but he does need Nahida. What holds her back behind the other characters here is that she didn't actually get very many new teams with Fontaine. We got a lot of new broken characters, but not really any of them needed Nahida. Like Chlorand does, but doesn't even need Nahida. Like Baizhu is often used more than Nahida these days. She's still crazy. She applies so much Dendro. She buffs the on-fielders EM. She does solid off-field damage, but the teams just aren't as insane as they were before. And so yeah, I'm actually gonna pop her just behind Bennett. Well, I don't know, Bennett's quality of life is pretty nasty. So yeah, she's just not as insane as she used to be because we haven't gotten a ton of new stuff for her, and a lot of the top teams just don't use Dendro, or don't require that Dendro to be Nahida. Yelan is really, really good. And she's gotten even better with Fontaine. Basically, if you don't have Novelette, you pretty much want to be getting Yelan, and that's going to be the character that you're going to be pairing with your Farina. She just has such crazy Farina synergy between the HP, Hydra Resonance, both of them hugely benefiting from that. The damage bonus that she gives stacking on top of Farina's, the energy reduction from Farina giving some energy, and Yelan, if she has her signature weapon on a Farina team and you're, getting some VV buffs or debuffs, she is doing main DPS levels of damage from off field. Just nutty levels of DPS. She's best in slot with a lot of Nahida teams, with Arlecchino, with Alhaitham, pretty close to best in slot anyways. She's a good partner for Chlorand, although not best in slot. She works with Nilou, not best in slot. Works with Navia, not best in slot. Works with Shangling, works with Hu Tao, Wanderer, Kokomi. Her skill is great for repositioning. Mostly it's just, she's got it all. She's got off-field Hydro application, which is very useful for reactions. She's got great off-field damage. She's got a great free-to-play weapon and a great 5-star weapon. So does Novelette, by the way. She also buffs the on-field character. It's just crazy. You can also use her instead of getting Farina. Like if you don't want to get Farina, she can function as sort of an alternative. Obviously you drop the healer and put someone else in, or like you don't need a healer, you can use something else. I do want to emphasize, even at the very top tier, you don't need any of these characters, right? There's still lots of great options that don't use these characters. Any given character, you've got other options as well. But we won't drag it anymore. It's been very obvious the whole time. Farina is the best character in Genshin Impact. She has an absolutely nutty buff, the biggest buff in the entire game, and it goes to all the characters on the team in the form of damage percent, which affects all types of damage except for like Nilou's blooms or hyper blooms. But she also does very respectable personal damage. She applies enough hydro for some characters to vape, and enough to at least be a beneficial reaction. Sometimes she can vape herself, so she consolidates being one of the best off-field DPSs along with being the best buffer in the game. And all it takes is you need to run a healer, and most teams run a healer anyways, or some teams are their own healers, such as Chlorand or Novelette. That's one thing I didn't talk about Chlorand, by the way, is the fact that she heals herself makes her, even though it's not a ton, it makes her very flexible in the teammates that she can have, and she can have really good teammates. What can you say? Basically every top team uses Farina except for Arlecchino. Basically every character has a variant where they want to be using Farina, right? Novelette's best team uses Farina. Lots of Nahida's best teams use Farina. Arlecchino doesn't, but Chlorand's do, Alhaitham's does, one of Nilou's best team uses Farina, Shangling, Navia, Raiden, Hu Tao, Linny, Zhao, Wanderer, all of them, Kokomi, all of them use Farina as part of their best team. Best character in the game. Not counted for this video, but something to consider is that she also has the best constellations in the game, both the best C1 and the best C2. So if you're interested in vertical investing, she's the way. That is the final video. If you want to see the full super nice screenshot, once again, go to the Tactor link down below, leave a comment to be entered into the giveaway for the 5 Welkin Moons, and you'll also be able to see the little edits I made to the tier list to annotate, requires another character, requires a constellation, requires a lot of skill to play. Obviously, let me know where you disagree, but remember to be respectful and considerate. And I did put a lot of time into testing every single character and made this list to be as unbiased as I possibly could to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. So thanks a lot. Take care. Bye for now.